Valentine's Day was never meant to celebrate love. Not the kind you're thinking of. No hearts, no roses, no whispered promises. What if I told you that this holiday, now wrapped in pink paper and sweet words, was born from fear, bloodlines, and survival? That long before love letters existed, February was a time people dreaded, not desired. A season when life felt fragile, when death hovered close, and when rituals mattered more than romance. The version of Valentine's Day you know is a mask, soft, comforting, familiar. Beneath it lies something far older and far darker. Tonight, we're not here to ruin love. We're here to uncover the truth that history buried, layer by layer, until the original meaning disappeared entirely. And once you see where this day truly began, you may never look at it the same way again. Today, Valentine's Day feels harmless, gentle, almost inevitable. Stores glow with red and pink, couples pose for photos, children exchange cards covered in glitter and smiles. We're taught that love is the reason this day exists, as if it has always been that way. But history rarely works like that. Traditions don't appear fully formed. They evolve, often from places we would rather forget. The symbols we recognize are recent additions, painted over centuries of older beliefs. Long before chocolates and cards, February was marked by anxiety. People watched the skies. They watched their animals. They watched each other. Because survival, not romance, was the true obsession of the season. The question isn't when Valentine's Day became about love. The real question is what it was before love ever entered the story. To understand the truth, we have to step into a world where nature ruled everything, where winter stretched long and unforgiving, where food ran low, sickness spread easily, and the line between life and death felt thin. February wasn't romantic, it was dangerous. People believed unseen forces controlled their fate, and rituals were their only defense. Communities gathered not to celebrate love, but to protect themselves from chaos, from hunger, from extinction. What happened during this time of year was meant to restore balance, ensure fertility, and secure survival. These were not gentle ceremonies. They were urgent, desperate, and deeply serious. Love, as we define it today, had no place here. What mattered was continuation of families, of crops, of life itself. And that is where the real story begins. Power also played a role, more than most people realize. These early traditions weren't just about survival, they were about control. Who led the rituals? Who decided their meaning? Who benefited from them? Fear has always been a powerful tool, and in the ancient world, belief could unite or dominate an entire population. Rituals shaped behavior. They told people when to gather, who to trust, and what sacrifices were necessary. Over time, these customs became embedded so deeply that questioning them felt dangerous. As generations passed, the original reasons blurred, but the traditions remained. And when new belief systems rose, they didn't erase these rituals. They reshaped them, renamed them, softened their edges. The past wasn't destroyed, it was repackaged, and Valentine's Day is one of the clearest examples of that transformation. What makes this story unsettling isn't that love came later, it's how completely the original meaning was erased. The danger, the fear, the urgency, all replaced with symbols that feel safe and pleasant. History often does this. It smooths rough truths into comforting stories we can live with. But the older version of Valentine's Day wasn't gentle or sweet. It was raw, physical, grounded in the belief that without action, something terrible would happen. That belief shaped everything that followed. Even the name we use today carries echoes of that past, though few recognize it anymore. Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking why this day exists and accepted the story we were given. But once you start pulling at the thread, the whole illusion begins to unravel. We'll travel back to ancient Rome, before cards, before flowers, before romance had anything to do with February. You'll learn about a festival rooted in fear and fertility, where chance decided fate and survival outweighed sentiment. A ritual so far removed from modern Valentine's Day that it feels almost impossible they could be connected at all. And yet, they are, directly. The transformation from that world to ours didn't happen by accident. It was deliberate, strategic, and deeply revealing about how history is rewritten. This is where the mask first formed. This is where love was layered over something far older. And once you see what happened there, you'll understand why Valentine's Day was never about love to begin with. Long before Valentine's Day carried any hint of tenderness, Rome marked mid-February with a festival called Lupercalia, a name spoken with familiarity, not affection. The city didn't slow down for it. It tightened. The air felt charged, crowded streets pressing inward as people gathered with a shared understanding that something powerful was about to unfold. This was not a celebration you watched from a distance. It demanded participation, belief, and obedience. Romans saw this moment as a turning point in the year, when unseen forces could be influenced, when fate could tilt toward life instead of loss. Fertility was not a metaphor here. It was survival. Without children, without crops, without strength, the future vanished. Lupercalia existed to confront that fear head-on, using ritual as a shield against the unknown. At the heart of Lupercalia was belief that chaos could be managed through ceremony. Priests, known as Luperci, prepared in sacred spaces tied to Rome's origin myths, places believed to hold raw power. Incense hung heavy in the air. Chants echoed off stone walls. Nothing felt playful or romantic. Every gesture carried meaning. Every step followed tradition. Romans believed fertility didn't happen naturally. It had to be encouraged, even forced, through ritual action. The gods were unpredictable, and neglecting them invited disaster. Lupercalia was Rome's answer to uncertainty, blending religion and fear into a single public act. People didn't attend because they wanted to. They attended because not attending felt dangerous. One of the most unsettling elements of Lupercalia was how chance ruled human fate. Names were drawn. Pairings were decided by luck rather than choice. For Romans, chance wasn't romantic. It was divine. Randomness meant the gods were speaking. These temporary bonds weren't about affection or connection. They were believed to increase fertility, to bring balance, to satisfy forces humans couldn't see or control. Emotion didn't matter. Consent, as we understand it today, didn't exist in the same way. What mattered was participation. To resist was to defy tradition, and defiance carried consequences. In this world, love was irrelevant. Bodies were symbols. people were instruments of ritual. The atmosphere of Lupercalia was loud, chaotic, and charged with nervous energy. Drums echoed through narrow streets. Crowds surged forward, not knowing exactly what would happen next, but trusting that it had to happen. The rituals were meant to purify the city, to drive away evil, to ensure fertility for women and strength for men. Fear sat just beneath the surface of celebration. This wasn't joy, it was relief mixed with anxiety. People laughed not because they were happy, but because tension demanded release. Authority figures watched closely, reinforcing that this was not a game. Lupercalia reminded everyone of their place within the social order and the invisible forces believed to govern their lives. Control was woven into every part of the festival. Religious leaders dictated the rituals, tradition dictated behavior, fear ensured compliance. Lupercalia wasn't just about fertility, it was about unity through shared belief. When everyone participates in the same ritual, questioning it becomes harder. Over time, repetition turns custom into truth. Romans didn't see these practices as brutal, they saw them as necessary. Survival justified discomfort, order justified sacrifice, and because the festival was framed as sacred, it shielded itself from criticism. This is how rituals endure, by convincing people that without them, everything falls apart. Nothing about Lupercalia resembles what we now associate with Valentine's Day. No romance, no intimacy, no emotional connection. Just belief, fear, and the desperate need to survive another year. And yet, this festival did not disappear. It changed, softened, reframed. Its rough edges slowly hidden beneath new meanings and gentler stories. That transformation raises an unsettling question. How does a ritual born from superstition, chance, and control become a global celebration of love? What had to be erased, rewritten, or forgotten for that to happen? Because if this is where Valentine's Day truly began, then the story we tell ourselves today is missing something crucial. As the old rituals faded from public memory, a new figure slowly emerged from the shadows. One remembered not for chaos, but for devotion. His name was Saint Valentine, though even that name does not belong to a single clear story. In the quiet records of the early church, Valentine appears more like an outline than a portrait. A man, or possibly several men, linked by fragments of memory, whispered acts of faith, and accounts written long after the fact. What survives is not certainty, but intention. At a time when belief itself was dangerous, Valentine became a symbol of obedience to something higher than the state. Where Lupercalia thrived on noise and chance, this new story leaned into silence, sacrifice, and meaning. It did not erase the past overnight. It redirected it. The early church did not conquer the old traditions by destroying them. It absorbed them, reframed them, gave them new names and new meanings. Festivals tied too deeply to the calendar could not simply vanish. They had to be transformed. February already carried weight. People expected significance. So instead of ritual chaos, the church offered moral order. Instead of fertility rites, it presented devotion. The wild unpredictability of earlier ceremonies was replaced with stories of discipline and faith. Where bodies once symbolized survival, individuals now symbolized sacrifice. This was not accidental. It was strategy. By reshaping familiar dates and customs, the church could guide belief without provoking rebellion. The result was a quieter power, one rooted in symbolism rather than spectacle. But even Valentine's story resists clarity. Some accounts describe secret acts of faith, others hint at defiance. A few speak of compassion shown quietly, away from crowds and ceremonies. Yet none agree completely. Names overlap, timelines blur, details change depending on who tells the story and when. What matters is not what can be proven, but what was remembered. Valentine became less a man and more a message. His story offered something the old rituals could not, a sense of purpose rooted in meaning rather than fear. Where Lupercalia demanded participation, Valentine's legend invited belief. It asked people to look inward instead of outward, to see devotion as something personal rather than imposed by chance. This shift marked a profound emotional contrast. The ancient world of ritual was loud, physical, and communal. Valentine's story was quiet, restrained, and individual. Brutality did not disappear, but it was reframed. Suffering became meaningful. Obedience became virtuous. Sacrifice became sacred. The chaos of fate we replaced by the promise of order. In this new narrative, power no longer came from confronting fear through ritual, but from enduring it through faith. The old world sought control through action. The new world sought control through belief. And slowly, the balance of meaning began to tilt. What the church preserved was not history, but usefulness. Stories were selected, refined, and repeated because they served a purpose. Over time, repetition became truth. Valentine's name endured because it fit the moment, a symbol that could stand where older meanings once lived. This is how myth forms, not from lies, but from emphasis. Certain details are lifted into the light, while others are allowed to disappear. The rough edges of the past were smoothed. The fear was softened. The rituals were moralized. And February, once a time of dread, began to feel different. Not safe, not yet, but changed. By the time Valentine's name settled into the calendar, something irreversible had begun. The meaning of the season was no longer rooted in survival alone. It was drifting toward symbolism, toward story, toward a new emotional language that would eventually reshape how people understood connection itself. But this was only the beginning. The transformation was incomplete, still fragile, still contested. The old world had not fully vanished. It was waiting to be reinterpreted once more. And in the chapters ahead, that reinterpretation would change everything.
Centuries passed, and the world softened. The drums faded, the crowds thinned. Ritual gave way to reflection. In medieval Europe, Valentine's Day no longer echoed with fear or urgency. It lingered quietly on the edges of the calendar, waiting to be reimagined. This was an age of castles and corridors, of long winters and longer thoughts. Love was no longer something imposed by fate or ritual. It became something imagined. Poets began to look inward, turning emotion into language, longing into art. February, once heavy with survival, slowly became a season of contemplation. The past did not disappear. It slept beneath layers of story, waiting to be rewritten by those who believed words could transform meaning itself. It was writers and poets who changed everything. In their verses, love became distant, elevated, and often unreachable. This was the rise of courtly love, a concept built not on possession, but on yearning. Knights admired from afar. Letters carried emotions that voices could not. Desire thrived in restraint. Love was no longer physical survival or ritual obligation. It was emotional tension stretched across silence and space. Valentine's Day found new footing here, not through command or fear, but through association. If love was to be imagined, then February, once a time of unease, could become a canvas for longing. The day began to feel symbolic, not sacred. Handwritten letters became vessels of emotion. Ink carried thoughts that could not be spoken aloud. These messages were private, intentional, and deeply personal. Unlike ancient rituals shared by entire cities, this new form of love belonged to individuals. The act of writing itself became meaningful, the pause before each word, the care in every line. Valentine's Day slowly absorbed this intimacy. It was no longer about what people did together in public, but what they felt alone. Love shifted inward, and as it did, history followed quietly behind, reshaping itself to fit the new story people wanted to tell about connection. This transformation did not happen overnight. Old meanings lingered, faint but present, yet imagination proved powerful. Stories repeated often enough became truth. Valentine, once an uncertain figure of devotion, now stood comfortably beside ideas of romance and loyalty. The day no longer demanded belief, it invited interpretation. Writers linked birds choosing mates in February to human affection. Nature itself was folded into the narrative. These associations were gentle, poetic, and persuasive. They did not erase the past, they quietly covered it, replacing memory with metaphor. Valentine's Day became less about history and more about how people wanted to feel. What emerged was a version of love shaped by distance rather than closeness. Absence became meaningful. Waiting became romantic. This was a stark contrast to earlier centuries, where immediacy and action ruled. Now, emotion lived in anticipation. Valentine's Day reflected that shift. It asked nothing of the body and everything of the imagination. The rituals were gone, replaced by symbols, words, gestures, glances. Love no longer needed to ensure survival. It needed only to be felt. And as this gentler idea spread, it prepared the ground for something even more transformative, something that would carry these symbols far beyond castles and poems. By the end of the medieval era, Valentine's Day had become a story people told themselves, a quiet promise wrapped in language and hope. It was no longer feared, it was anticipated. But stories, once released, do not stay still. As societies grew, as cities expanded, and as markets awakened, these symbols would soon find new purpose. Love would move from page to practice, from imagination to exchange. The transformation was almost complete, and in the next chapter, that intimacy, once private and poetic, would step into the public world, where culture and commerce would reshape Valentine's Day once again.
The final transformation of Valentine's Day did not come from poets or priests. It came from machines. As the world industrialized, intimacy collided with efficiency. Printing presses multiplied words, factories multiplied objects. What was once handwritten and rare became reproducible and shared by millions. Cards, decorations, and symbols could now travel faster than stories ever had. Valentine's Day stepped into a new role, no longer shaped by villages or courts, but by cities and systems. This shift didn't erase meaning, it reorganized it. Love became something you could hold, send, and repeat on a massive scale. The holiday grew louder, brighter, and more visible, carried forward not by ritual or verse, but by the steady rhythm of production. As production increased, Valentine's Day spread beyond borders. What had once belonged to specific cultures and calendars became global, recognizable almost everywhere at once. Symbols were simplified so they could be understood instantly. Hearts, colors, gestures repeated until they felt universal. This standardization made the holiday easy to adopt, easy to remember, and easy to share. In the process, complexity was trimmed away. Local traditions softened into a single shared language of affection. Some saw this as loss, others saw it as connection. Valentine's Day no longer asked where you came from. It only asked that you participate. Criticism followed closely behind. Many questioned whether love could survive repetition, whether meaning could remain intact once it became expected. Some argued the day felt hollow, routine, even forced. These critiques were not without reason. When symbols are everywhere, they risk becoming invisible. But criticism alone doesn't explain why Valentine's Day endured. If the holiday were truly empty, it would have faded. Instead, it persisted, quietly reshaping itself again and again to fit the emotional needs of each era. Beneath the surface noise, something human remained. Because Valentine's Day was never only about romance. Over time, it expanded, making room for friendships, family, memory, and absence. It became a day not just to celebrate love, but to acknowledge it, to name it, to pause and recognize connection in a world that rarely slows down. Even when the gestures feel small, the act of noticing matters. In that way, the holiday returned to something ancient, not ritual or fear, but intention. A moment set aside in the calendar where emotion is allowed to speak first. What Valentine's Day represents now is not its origin, but its evolution. It carries traces of every era it passed through: ritual urgency, symbolic devotion, poetic longing, collective participation. History did not move in a straight line. It layered meaning over meaning, until the original shape was no longer visible. But that doesn't make the present version false. It makes it human. We inherit traditions the same way we inherit stories, imperfect, reshaped, but still capable of holding truth. Valentine's Day no longer tells us how to love. It simply reminds us to remember love exists. So, if Valentine's Day didn't begin with love, why do we still need it? Because humans have always needed markers in time, moments that interrupt routine and point us back to what matters. We need reminders, not because love is rare, but because attention is. Valentine's Day survives not as a historical truth, but as an emotional one. It gives shape to feelings that otherwise pass unspoken. It offers permission to pause, to reach out, to remember. And perhaps that is the quiet truth at the heart of it all. Traditions don't endure because of where they start, but because of what they become.